The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Metropolitan General Hospital as Dr. Sarah Martinez, the chief of surgery, made her way to the observation deck above Operating Room 3. It was 7:15 a.m., and she had specifically arrived early to watch one of her newest attending physicians perform an emergency appendectomy. Dr. James Wilson had joined their surgical team 3 months ago, bringing with him impressive credentials from Johns Hopkins and a quiet confidence that had immediately impressed Dr. Martinez during his interviews. Being one of the few black surgeons in their department hadn't seemed to faze him, but Martinez had been in medicine long enough to know that excellence wasn't always enough to shield someone from prejudice. As she settled into her seat in the observation deck, she noticed she wasn't alone. Dr. Richard Thompson, one of the senior surgeons who had been with the hospital for 20 years, sat in the corner, his arms crossed and his expression already set in a familiar frown. Thompson hadn't bothered to hide his displeasure when Wilson was hired, though he'd been careful to never say anything directly objectionable. Below them, Dr. Wilson moved with precise efficiency as he prepared for the surgery. His team worked smoothly around him, responding to his clear, calm instructions. Martinez noticed how he took a moment to reassure the nervous teenage patient before the anesthesia took effect, a small gesture that spoke volumes about his character. Unnecessary coddling, Thompson muttered from his corner, just loud enough for Martinez to hear. We're surgeons, not therapists. Martinez chose not to respond, instead focusing on Wilson's technique as he began the procedure. His movements were confident and skilled, showing years of training and natural talent. The operating room staff moved in perfect sync with him, something that usually took months to achieve with a new surgeon. Halfway through the procedure, Wilson encountered an unexpected complication. The patient's appendix had an unusual position, making the standard approach more challenging. Without hesitation, he adjusted his technique, carefully navigating the complicated anatomy while keeping his team informed of each step. Thompson shifted in his seat, leaning forward with an almost eager expression. Martinez knew that look. He was hoping to see a mistake, waiting for any small error he could document and criticize later. But Wilson handled the situation flawlessly, completing the procedure with the same steady expertise he'd shown from the start. Lucky, Thompson said under his breath, gathering his things to leave. Just lucky. As Thompson walked past her, Martinez spoke without taking her eyes off the operating room below. Dr. Thompson, I'd like to see you in my office at 2 p.m. today. He paused, surprised by her request. I have a full schedule today, Dr. Martinez. Perhaps tomorrow would be better. 2 p.m. today, she repeated firmly, finally turning to look at him. It's not a request. After Thompson left, Martinez continued watching as Wilson closed up the incision with careful, precise stitches. She'd been paying attention to more than just his surgical skills over the past 3 months. She'd seen how he stayed late to check on patients, how he took time to explain procedures to nervous family members, and how he helped guide the resident physicians with patience and respect. She'd also been watching Thompson, the accidental schedule conflicts that left Wilson with the most difficult cases, the whispered comments to other staff members, the excessive scrutiny of Wilson's paperwork while other doctors' reports went unquestioned. Martinez had been collecting evidence, documenting every incident, and building a case that would be impossible to ignore. As Wilson finished the surgery and thanked his team, Martinez smiled slightly. Thompson had no idea that his every move had been observed and recorded for the past 3 months. He didn't know that Martinez had already spoken with the hospital board, or that she had contact with administrators from his previous hospitals who had similar concerns but had never acted on them. Most importantly, Thompson had no idea that Dr. Sarah Martinez had spent her 30-year career breaking down exactly these kinds of barriers in medicine. She hadn't become the first female chief of surgery at Metropolitan General by ignoring discrimination when she saw it. As she stood to leave the observation deck, Martinez checked her watch. It was only 8:30 a.m., giving her plenty of time to prepare for her 2 p.m. meeting with Thompson. She had a feeling it would be a conversation he wouldn't soon forget. Down in the operating room, Dr. Wilson was already preparing his notes on the successful surgery, unaware of the storm brewing above him or the fierce advocate he had in his corner. 2 weeks passed after the appendectomy incident, and the tension at Metropolitan General Hospital grew thicker with each passing day. Dr. Wilson continued his work with the same dedication and skill that had become his trademark, but Dr. Thompson's attempts to undermine him became increasingly obvious. One busy Tuesday morning, Wilson arrived at his office to find a stack of charts on his desk marked Urgent Review Needed in Thompson's distinctive handwriting. As he flipped through them, he realized they were all cases he had handled over the past month. Cases that had already been reviewed and approved. Something interesting in those files, Dr. Wilson. Thompson's voice came from the doorway, where he stood with two other senior surgeons. I noticed some concerning patterns in your decision-making process. Thought we should discuss them at today's staff meeting. Wilson maintained his composure, looking Thompson directly in the eyes. Of course, I'm always open to constructive feedback. His calm response seemed to irritate Thompson even more. Later that morning, Wilson successfully completed a challenging heart valve replacement. The patient's family hugged him with tears of joy, thanking him repeatedly in the recovery room. Thompson, who had been passing by, watched the scene with narrowed eyes. During the afternoon staff meeting, Thompson made his move. He pulled up Wilson's cases on the projector screen, pointing out what he claimed were questionable choices in 3 different surgeries. But Wilson was prepared. He calmly pulled out his detailed notes and explained each decision with clear medical reasoning and references to current best practices. In the Stevens case, Wilson explained, showing his own slides, the traditional approach would have increased the risk of complications due to the patient's unique anatomy. The modified technique I used is supported by recent research from Mayo Clinic. Dr. Martinez sat quietly at the end of the table, watching the exchange. She noticed how other doctors in the room began nodding along with Wilson's explanations, while Thompson's face grew increasingly red. After the meeting, Wilson was checking on his post-op patients when Sarah, one of the veteran nurses, stopped him in the hallway. Dr. Wilson, she whispered, looking around to make sure they were alone. You should know that Dr. Thompson has been asking us to document any small mistakes you make. He even suggested we should pay extra attention to your cases. Wilson thanked her for the information, his face never showing the frustration he felt inside. As he continued his rounds, he overheard Thompson speaking to a group of residents near the nurses' station. I'm just saying, Thompson was telling them, some people get their positions through different standards. We have to maintain quality control. The implications in his voice were clear. That evening, as Wilson was finishing his paperwork, Dr. Martinez stopped by his office. She watched as he meticulously documented his last surgery of the day, noting how he double-checked every detail despite the late hour. Long day? She asked, stepping into the office. Every day is a learning opportunity, Wilson replied with a slight smile, using one of the phrases he often shared with his residents. Martinez nodded, noticing the stack of re-reviewed charts on his desk. I see Dr. Thompson has been keeping you busy with extra paperwork. Nothing I can't handle, Wilson assured her, though they both knew what was really happening. As Martinez left his office, she passed Thompson in the hallway. He was still there, despite his shift ending hours ago, methodically going through Wilson's patient files from the past week. What Thompson didn't notice was Martinez taking a photo of him accessing patient records after hours without proper authorization. She added it to her growing file of evidence, along with statements from nurses, timestamp records of Thompson's targeted chart reviews, and documentation of his selective criticism during meetings. The next morning, Wilson arrived early as usual, ready for another day of saving lives and facing challenges. He found 3 more charts on his desk marked for review, but this time there was also a small note from Nurse Sarah. We see what's happening. You're not alone. As he prepared for his first surgery of the day, Wilson remained focused and professional, unaware that the next few days would bring everything to a head. Meanwhile, up in her office, Dr. Martinez was preparing to make her next move in a game that Thompson didn't even know he was losing. The following Monday morning, the tension at Metropolitan General Hospital reached its breaking point. Dr. Thompson marched into the hospital's administrative office, clutching a thick manila folder and demanding an immediate meeting with the board secretary. I'm filing a formal complaint against Dr. James Wilson, Thompson announced loudly enough for everyone in the office to hear. I have substantial evidence of procedural violations and questionable medical decisions that put patients at risk. Behind her desk, Linda Chen, the board secretary for 15 years, kept her face carefully neutral as she accepted the folder. She'd seen Thompson's type of complaint before, and she had her own opinions about his motivations. As soon as Thompson left, she made 2 copies of the complaint, one for the official record and one that went straight to Dr. Martinez's office. Throughout the day, Thompson went from department to department, speaking to various staff members in hushed tones. "You've noticed Dr. Wilson's unusual methods, haven't you?" he would ask, pulling out his notebook. "Would you be willing to add your observations to my report?" Most staff members gave noncommittal responses, but a few, hoping to curry favor with the senior surgeon, agreed to sign statements Thompson had prepared. What they didn't know was that every conversation was being carefully noted by the hospital staff who had grown tired of Thompson's behavior. During lunch, Thompson cornered Dr. Rodriguez, a young surgeon who often assisted Wilson in complex procedures. "Look," Thompson said, sliding into the seat across from him in the cafeteria, "your future here could be very bright. But supporting the wrong people could damage your career. You understand what I'm saying?" Rodriguez stared at his half-eaten sandwich, uncomfortable with the implied threat. "Dr. Wilson is an excellent surgeon," he finally said, standing up. "If you want my professional opinion, that's it." He walked away, leaving Thompson fuming. Later that afternoon, Wilson was preparing for a scheduled bypass surgery when Thompson appeared in the scrub room. "I wouldn't go in there if I were you," Thompson said with fake concern in his voice. "The board is reviewing your practices. Wouldn't want to risk another patient until that's sorted out." Wilson continued scrubbing his hands methodically. "My patient has been prepped and is waiting. Unless you have official documentation suspending my privileges, I have a surgery to perform." Thompson's face darkened. "You're making a mistake. One more questionable decision, and... Is there a problem here?" Dr. Martinez's voice cut through the tension. She stood in the doorway, her expression stern. "Just expressing some professional concerns," Thompson replied smoothly, "as is my duty as a senior surgeon." Martinez stepped closer. "Your duty, Dr. Thompson, is to assist with the Williams bypass in OR2, unless you prefer to explain to the board why you're attempting to interfere with another surgeon's scheduled procedure." Thompson left without another word, but his actions had already set bigger wheels in motion. Throughout the hospital, nurses, residents, and other staff members began coming forward, sharing their experiences with Dr. Martinez's office. By late afternoon, Thompson was feeling confident. He had submitted his complaint, gathered supporting statements, and was sure he had finally found a way to remove Wilson from his position. He was reviewing his next moves in his office when his phone buzzed with a message from the board secretary. "Emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Attendance mandatory." Thompson smiled, assuming his complaint had prompted such quick action. He began preparing his presentation, carefully selecting incidents that, taken out of context, could support his claims against Wilson. What Thompson didn't know was that Dr. Martinez was in her office at that very moment, reviewing security footage of Thompson accessing patient files after hours, reading statements from staff about his intimidation tactics, and examining data that showed his pattern of targeting Wilson while ignoring similar practices by other surgeons. As the day ended, Wilson successfully completed his bypass surgery, his patient stable and recovering well. He had no idea about Thompson's formal complaint or the emergency board meeting scheduled for the next day. He simply did what he always did, provided excellent care to his patients while maintaining his professionalism in the face of adversity. In her office, Dr. Martinez sent one final email confirming the board meeting, then sat back in her chair. Tomorrow would be interesting, she thought, as she looked at the extensive file of evidence she had gathered. Tomorrow, Dr. Thompson would learn exactly who had been watching whom. The weight of Thompson's constant scrutiny was finally starting to show in small ways, even though Dr. Wilson worked hard to maintain his professional demeanor. That Wednesday morning, Wilson sat in the doctor's lounge, staring at his untouched coffee while reviewing his surgical schedule for the day. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights spent double and triple checking his documentation, making sure every decision was supported by multiple medical references. His phone buzzed constantly with texts from colleagues at other hospitals, responding to his quiet requests for second opinions on challenging cases. "You look like you could use this more than me," Dr. Rodriguez said, sliding a fresh bagel across the table. He had noticed how Wilson had been arriving earlier and leaving later, trying to stay ahead of Thompson's relentless criticism. "Thanks." Wilson managed a tired smile. Just been a busy week. As they sat there, other staff members in the lounge were having their own quiet conversations. Nurse Sarah whispered to her colleague about how Thompson had spent an hour the previous day questioning her about Wilson's post-operative care instructions. Another surgeon mentioned that Thompson had tried to convince him to report Wilson for using an innovative surgical technique that was actually becoming standard practice at leading hospitals. "Did you hear?" a resident whispered too loudly to her friend. "Dr. Thompson is trying to get statements from everyone who's ever worked with Dr. Wilson. He even tried to contact Wilson's old medical school professors." Wilson pretended not to hear, but his hand tightened slightly around his coffee cup. Rodriguez noticed and quickly changed the subject, discussing an interesting case from the previous day. Later that morning, Wilson was performing a routine gallbladder removal when he noticed Thompson watching from the observation deck again. The senior surgeon's constant presence had become so common that the operating room staff had started calling him the Shadow. "Suction, please," Wilson requested calmly, though he could feel Thompson's critical eyes analyzing his every move. The surgical intern's hands trembled slightly as she assisted, knowing any small mistake would be documented and potentially used against her mentor. During the hospital's weekly department meeting, Wilson presented his cases as usual, but this time he noticed how some colleagues avoided making eye contact while others shot him sympathetic glances. Thompson sat in the back, smirking as he took detailed notes. "Your infection prevention rates are impressive, Dr. Wilson," Dr. Martinez commented during the presentation, her voice carrying a clear message of support. "Perhaps you could share your techniques with the department?" Before Wilson could respond, Thompson interrupted. "Are we sure these numbers are accurate? I've noticed some discrepancies in the reporting methods." The room fell silent. Everyone knew Thompson's accusation was baseless. Wilson's excellent outcomes were well documented and verified by the hospital's independent quality control team. That afternoon, Wilson was reviewing a patient's chart at the nurse's station when he overheard two nurses discussing Thompson's latest tactics. "He tried to make me say Dr. Wilson was rude to patients," one nurse said, "but I've never seen him be anything but kind and professional." "Thompson's just jealous," the other replied. "Dr. Wilson's patients love him, and his success rates are better than Thompson's ever were." Wilson cleared his throat quietly to let them know he was there, and they quickly scattered, embarrassed to be caught gossiping. He returned to his charting, trying to ignore the knot of tension that had become permanent in his shoulders. At the end of his shift, Wilson stood in the parking lot, taking a moment to collect himself before heading home. The setting sun cast long shadows across the hospital grounds, reminding him of the dark cloud that seemed to follow him these days. "Dr. Wilson," a voice called out. It was an elderly patient he had operated on last month, walking slowly with her daughter. "I just had my follow-up with Dr. Thompson, and he asked so many strange questions about you. I told him you were the best doctor I've ever had." Wilson thanked her kindly, but as he watched them walk away, he couldn't help wondering how many more patients Thompson had interrogated, searching for any complaint he could use. As he finally drove home that evening, Wilson didn't know that the next day would bring everything to a head. In her office, Dr. Martinez was preparing for the biggest confrontation of her career, while Thompson was about to learn that his careful plan had one fatal flaw. He had never considered who might be watching him. The monthly Morbidity and Mortality (M&M) conference room was packed that Thursday morning. These meetings were always important, but today felt different. There was an unusual tension in the air as doctors, nurses, and residents filed in, whispering among themselves. Dr. Thompson sat in the front row, a thick folder of documents placed precisely on the table before him. He kept checking his watch and straightening his tie, clearly anticipating what he thought would be his moment of triumph. Several of his loyal supporters sat nearby, their own notebooks ready. Dr. Wilson arrived exactly on time, taking his usual seat in the middle of the room. A few colleagues nodded encouragingly at him, while others awkwardly looked away. He noticed some empty seats around him, people choosing to distance themselves from what they expected would be an uncomfortable confrontation. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Dr. Martinez entered the room. Instead of her usual files, she wheeled in a small cart loaded with several boxes of documents and a laptop. The room fell silent as she began setting up the projection system. "Today's M&M conference will be slightly different," Martinez announced, her voice calm but firm. Dr. Thompson has requested a review of several recent cases. He has some concerns he'd like to present. Thompson stood up, straightening his white coat. Thank you, Dr. Martinez. I prepared a detailed analysis of Dr. Wilson's last 50 surgical cases, and I've identified several troubling patterns. He began his presentation, displaying carefully selected snippets of medical records and surgical notes. With each slide, he painted a picture of what he claimed were questionable decisions and risky techniques. In this case, Thompson said, pointing to a particular surgery, Dr. Wilson chose an unconventional approach that could have endangered the patient. Wilson sat quietly, his face neutral, though his colleagues could see his hands clasped tightly together under the table. And in this instance, Thompson continued, clearly building to what he thought was his knockout punch, we see another example of deviation from standard protocols. Thank you, Dr. Thompson, Martinez interrupted, standing up. Now, I'd like to show my own analysis of these same cases. She clicked her remote, and a new set of slides appeared on the screen. These showed complete patient records, not just the selective portions Thompson had chosen. Each case Thompson had criticized was shown in its full context, along with patient outcomes and recovery data. Let's look at the case you just mentioned, Martinez said, pulling up the complete file. Dr. Wilson's unconventional approach was actually a technique published in the Journal of Advanced Surgery 3 months ago, a technique that has shown a 30% better recovery rate. Thompson's confident smile began to fade as Martinez continued presenting. She showed statistics comparing Wilson's success rates with those of other surgeons, including Thompson's. The numbers clearly showed Wilson's superior outcomes. But perhaps most interesting, Martinez said, her voice taking on a harder edge, is this pattern I've noticed. She displayed a new slide showing a timeline of Thompson's complaints and interventions. Every single incident of his criticism coincided with one of Wilson's successful surgeries or positive patient outcomes. Dr. Thompson, Martinez turned to face him directly. Would you like to explain why you accessed Dr. Wilson's patient files after hours 27 times in the past month? Or why you've been pressuring staff members to sign pre-written complaints? The room erupted in murmurs. Thompson's face had gone pale, and he started shuffling through his papers, looking for a response. I was simply doing my duty as a senior surgeon, he stammered. Maintaining standards is crucial. Standards? Martinez clicked to her next slide, showing Thompson's own case statistics. Like these standards, your complication rates are nearly double Dr. Wilson's, and your patient satisfaction scores have been consistently lower. Wilson watched silently as his months of quiet endurance were finally vindicated. Around him, other doctors and staff members began speaking up, sharing their own observations of Thompson's behavior. As Thompson sat there, his carefully constructed case crumbling around him, Dr. Martinez wasn't finished. She reached for one of the boxes she had brought in, pulling out more documents. And now, she said, her voice cutting through the noise in the room, I'd like to share some interesting information I've received from your previous hospitals. Thompson's face went from pale to ashen. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't known that while he was watching Wilson, someone else had been watching him. Dr. Martinez stood firmly at the podium, her next set of documents spreading across the screen behind her. The M&M conference room had grown so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Over the past 3 months, Martinez began, her voice steady and clear, I've been in contact with administrators from Chicago General, Mayo Clinic, and Boston Memorial, Dr. Thompson's previous places of employment. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. The colleagues who had been supporting him moments ago were now slowly edging their chairs away. At Chicago General, Martinez continued, clicking to display official hospital documents. 3 talented surgeons resigned within 8 months of Dr. Thompson's arrival. All 3 were minorities. All 3 cited a hostile work environment in their exit interviews. She moved to the next slide. At Mayo Clinic, there were 7 formal complaints about discriminatory behavior. Interestingly, these complaints mysteriously disappeared from his file before they could be investigated. Thompson jumped to his feet, his face red. This is irrelevant. We're here to discuss Dr. Wilson's questionable practices. Sit down, Dr. Thompson, Martinez said firmly. I'm not finished. The room watched as she revealed document after document, building a clear pattern of Thompson's behavior across multiple institutions. His targeting of minority doctors, his manipulation of records, his intimidation of staff members, all of it laid bare before his colleagues. Most concerning, Martinez said, pulling up a new set of statistics, is this analysis of patient outcomes. When working alongside surgeons Dr. Thompson targeted, there was a notable increase in complications during joint procedures, almost as if someone was deliberately creating problems. Gasps filled the room. Several doctors who had signed Thompson's complaints now looked sick with regret. Dr. Wilson, still sitting quietly, thought about all the times he double-checked his instruments before surgeries, wondering if he was being paranoid. Now he knew his instincts had been right. Dr. Thompson, Martinez turned to face him directly. Would you like to explain why your surgical complication rates are significantly higher when assisting certain doctors? Thompson's face had turned from red to white. This is a witch hunt. You can't prove anything. Actually, Martinez clicked to her final slide. We can. We installed additional cameras in Operating Room 3 last month. Would you like to explain this footage? The screen showed Thompson deliberately misplacing surgical instruments during prep for one of Wilson's procedures. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Nurse Sarah stood up, her voice shaking but determined. 2 weeks ago, Dr. Thompson told me to give Dr. Wilson the wrong patient charts. He said it was a test of Dr. Wilson's attention to detail. I reported it to Dr. Martinez immediately. One by one, other staff members began speaking up. The resident who had been pressured to lie about Wilson's teaching methods. The anesthesiologist who had witnessed Thompson tampering with surgical schedules. The nurses who had been threatened with poor evaluations if they didn't support his complaints. Thompson looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed world crumbling. You don't understand, he sputtered. I was protecting our standards. These diversity hires. That's enough. Martinez's voice cut through his protest like a scalpel. Dr. Thompson, your privileges at this hospital are suspended, effective immediately. Security will escort you to clean out your office. As if on cue, 2 security guards appeared at the conference room door. Thompson looked around one last time, seeking support, but found none. His former allies were now staring at their shoes or openly glaring at him. As Thompson was led out, Martinez turned to address the remaining staff. Metropolitan General has zero tolerance for discrimination, harassment, or any behavior that compromises patient care. Dr. Wilson has shown exceptional skill, professionalism, and integrity in the face of persistent harassment. His record speaks for itself. She gestured to the statistical displays still showing Wilson's superior patient outcomes. This is what excellence looks like. This is our standard. Wilson finally allowed himself to relax slightly in his chair, feeling the weight of months of constant scrutiny beginning to lift. Around him, colleagues were now approaching to offer handshakes and words of support. But Martinez wasn't quite finished. As the room began to settle, she picked up another folder from her cart. Now, she said, let's discuss the changes we'll be making to ensure this never happens again. The hospital board meeting room felt unusually crowded that Friday morning. All 12 board members sat around the massive oak table, their expressions grave as they reviewed the extensive evidence before them. Dr. Thompson sat alone at one end, his usual confidence replaced by nervous fidgeting. Dr. Thompson, began Dr. Eleanor Chen, the board chairwoman, we've spent the last 24 hours reviewing Dr. Martinez's findings, and frankly, we're appalled. This goes far beyond professional disagreement. Thompson attempted to straighten his tie, a gesture that had lost all its previous authority. With all due respect, I believe this has been blown out of proportion. My concerns about Dr. Wilson were purely professional. Professional? Interrupted board member Jenkins, holding up a thick folder. We have documentation of you accessing confidential files after hours, manipulating surgical schedules, and attempting to intimidate staff members. There's nothing professional about that. The board secretary projected a new set of documents onto the wall screen. These weren't just from Metropolitan General. They showed a pattern stretching back 15 years across multiple hospitals. What's particularly disturbing, Dr. Chen continued, is what we discovered when we dug deeper into your history. You've managed to hide these incidents by moving from hospital to hospital, using your family's connections to keep things quiet. Thompson's face paled as he recognized some of the documents. Reports from Chicago General that his father, a prominent hospital donor, had helped bury. Complaints from Mayo Clinic that mysteriously disappeared after his uncle, a board member there, intervened. Would you care to explain, asked another board member, why every hospital you've worked at has seen an exodus of minority doctors within months of your arrival? I was maintaining standards, Thompson stammered, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Standards? Let's talk about standards. We've analyzed the outcomes of every surgeon you've targeted over the years. Without exception, they showed superior results to yours. Dr. Wilson's performance, in particular, is exemplary. The projector clicked to a new slide showing Thompson's own surgical statistics. His complication rates, patient complaints, and procedural errors were all significantly higher than the hospital's average. What we're seeing, Dr. Chen said firmly, is not a defender of medical standards, but a pattern of systematic discrimination hidden behind professional concerns. Thompson looked around desperately, but found no sympathetic faces. Even the board members who had originally supported his appointment sat stone-faced, their expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. Furthermore, Dr. Chen continued, we've received statements from 3 other hospitals warning us about similar incidents. Warnings that were apparently intercepted and hidden before they reached the proper authorities. A security officer entered the room, placing a small box of personal items from Thompson's office on the table. The message was clear. He wouldn't be returning to that office. Dr. Thompson, Dr. Chen's voice was firm. Your employment at Metropolitan General is terminated, effective immediately. We'll be reporting this incident to the State Medical Board and recommending a full investigation of your practice history. Thompson jumped to his feet. You can't do this. My father. Your father, interrupted Dr. Chen, has already been informed of the situation. Unlike previous institutions, Metropolitan General cannot be influenced by family connections or donations. As security prepared to escort Thompson out, Dr. Chen had one final statement. We've also notified the other hospitals where similar incidents occurred. They're reopening their investigations. The medical community is small, Dr. Thompson. This time, there's nowhere to hide. Thompson was led out of the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As the door closed behind him, the board members turned to discuss the broader implications of what had happened. We need systemic changes. Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly observing from the corner, finally spoke. This can't be just about removing one bad actor. We need to prevent this from happening again. Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. We've already drafted new policies for monitoring and reporting discriminatory behavior. But we'd like your input on implementing them, Dr. Martinez. Your handling of this situation has shown exactly the kind of leadership we need. As the board began discussing these new policies, Dr. Martinez thought about Dr. Wilson and all the other talented doctors who had faced similar discrimination. Today's actions wouldn't erase what they'd experienced, but it was a start toward ensuring no one else would have to endure the same treatment. The meeting continued well into the afternoon as they worked to transform a moment of justice into lasting change. 1 month after Thompson's dismissal, Metropolitan General Hospital had undergone significant changes. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly established Center for Surgical Excellence, where Dr. Wilson stood addressing a group of eager medical students and residents. Excellence isn't just about technical skill, Wilson explained, gesturing to the charts behind him. It's about integrity, teamwork, and putting patients first. The young doctors nodded, scribbling notes frantically. Wilson had become something of a legend in the hospital, though he remained as humble as ever. Dr. Martinez watched proudly from the doorway. The board had appointed Wilson as the Director of Surgical Education, a new position created to ensure that the next generation of surgeons would learn not just medical procedures, but also ethical practices and professional integrity. The hospital's corridors buzzed with a different energy now. Gone was the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Thompson had created. Instead, there was open collaboration, shared learning, and mutual respect among all staff members. Dr. Wilson, a young resident, raised her hand. I heard that several hospitals have asked you to join their staff. Are you planning to leave Metropolitan? Wilson smiled. shaking his head. This is home. More importantly, what we're building here is bigger than any one person. It's about creating a model for what healthcare should be. The changes weren't limited to Metropolitan General. The story of Thompson's misconduct and the hospital's response had sent ripples through the medical community. 3 other major hospitals had already adopted Metropolitan's new anti-discrimination protocols, and more were following suit. Later that afternoon, Dr. Martinez called a staff meeting to share some news. The conference room, once a place of tension and conflict, was now filled with comfortable chatter and genuine camaraderie. "I'm pleased to announce," Martinez began, "that our new monitoring system has been recognized by the American Medical Association as a model program. They're recommending its implementation nationwide." The staff broke into applause. The system, developed with input from Wilson and other doctors who had faced discrimination, included anonymous reporting channels, regular performance reviews based solely on medical outcomes, and mandatory ethics training for all staff members. "But there's more," Martinez continued. "Dr. Wilson's surgical education program has caught the attention of the National Medical Board. They want to use it as a template for other teaching hospitals." Wilson, sitting quietly in his usual spot, felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He thought about all the other talented doctors who had been forced out of their positions by people like Thompson. Now, finally, things were changing. The meeting shifted to discussing upcoming changes. The hospital was establishing a diversity and inclusion committee, led by doctors and staff from various backgrounds. They were also creating mentorship programs for minority medical students and residents. "Dr. Thompson's actions," Martinez explained, "showed us where we needed to improve. But your responses, your courage, integrity, and professionalism, showed us how to do it right." After the meeting, Wilson walked through the surgical ward, stopping to chat with patients and staff members. Nurse Sarah, who had been one of the first to speak up about Thompson's behavior, was showing a new nurse the proper way to prepare patient charts. Dr. Wilson called out Dr. Rodriguez, hurrying to catch up with him. "Remember that innovative procedure you used last month? We just got the follow-up results. The patient's recovery time was half what we typically see." Wilson nodded, pleased but not surprised. When doctors could focus on their work without fear of discrimination or harassment, everyone benefited, especially the patients. As the day drew to a close, Wilson stood at the same window where he had once watched Thompson's shadow looming over him. But now he saw something different reflected in the glass. A future where medical excellence was measured by skill, dedication, and compassion, not by prejudice or privilege. Dr. Martinez joined him at the window. "Thinking deep thoughts?" she asked with a smile. "Just grateful," Wilson replied. "Not everyone in my position has had someone willing to stand up for them." "Well," Martinez said, handing him a folder, "now we're making sure they do. The board just approved funding for 10 new surgical fellowships, specifically for underrepresented minorities in medicine." As they stood there watching the sunset over the hospital grounds, both doctors knew that while they couldn't change the past, they had helped create a better future. Metropolitan General had transformed from a place of hidden prejudice to a beacon of progress in medical education and professional ethics. The shadow of discrimination had finally been replaced by the light of justice and positive change.